He laughed first, but he was the only one laughing by the end. The restaurant glowed in soft amber light, crystal glasses catching reflections like tiny stars as conversations hummed low and steady, the kind of place where deals were made over $300 steaks and silence often meant power. And at the center of it all sat Victor Kane, a billionaire CEO who measured time in minutes and people in usefulness, his $4,000 suit perfectly pressed, his watch ticking louder than anyone dared notice. He didn't look up when Lena Brooks approached, not when she sat down. The water, not when she asked if he needed anything else. To him, she was part of the background, like the polished wood or the quiet music drifting from hidden speakers, just another waitress in a black uniform, invisible by design. But Lena noticed everything. The way his fingers tapped impatiently. The way his guest leaned forward just slightly when he spoke. The way he switched languages mid-sentence as if testing the room. And then he did it again, Icelandic this time, smooth, deliberate, a quiet performance meant to exclude, to control, to remind everyone at the table who held the advantage. One of the investors nodded uncertainly, clearly not understanding, but too polite to admit it, and Victor smirked. Just a little, as if that silence confirmed his superiority. Lena stood still. For a moment, her hand resting lightly against the edge of the table, her expression calm, unreadable. She had heard every word, every nuance, every mistake, but she said nothing, not yet. Instead, she turned slightly, as if to leave, as if she hadn't just caught the flaw hidden inside his sentence. But then Victor repeated the phrase. Slower this time, almost mockingly, glancing briefly in her direction. Not that it matters, he added in English, his tone casual, dismissive, and something in that moment shifted, subtle but undeniable. Lena's fingers tightened just slightly around the notepad she carried, her breath steady, her voice quiet when she finally spoke. It does matter, she said, barely above a whisper, but the words landed, clean and precise. And Victor paused, just for a second, enough for the table to notice. Enough for the air to change. He looked up then, really looked at her for the first time, his eyes narrowing, measuring, reassessing. Excuse me? He said, the edge in his voice sharper now, and Lena met his gaze without hesitation. No arrogance, no fear, just calm certainty. The clause you mentioned, she continued, her tone even. You translated it incorrectly. A beat of silence followed, long enough to feel uncomfortable. One of the investors shifted in his seat, another set down his glass, and Victor leaned back slightly, studying her as if she had just stepped out of place in a carefully controlled world. And you would know that. How? He asked, the faintest trace of amusement returning, but it didn't reach his eyes. Lena didn't answer right away. Instead, she repeated his sentence, this time in flawless Icelandic, each word crisp, each inflection exact. And for a brief moment, everything stopped. The background noise faded, the clinking glasses disappeared. Even the soft music seemed to fall away, leaving only her voice hanging in the air, steady and unshaken. And when she finished, she added one more line, in English, softer. Now, but somehow heavier. It changes the entire agreement. And this time, no one laughed, not even Victor Kane. No one moved, not even Victor Kane. And that was the first sign that something had gone very wrong, because men like him did not pause, they did not hesitate. They certainly did not get corrected by someone they had not even considered worth noticing 5 minutes ago. His fingers slowly slid away from the glass in front of him, the ice inside melting just enough to let out a soft crack that echoed louder than it should have. His eyes stayed locked on Lena Brooks, as if trying to solve a problem that refused to fit into any model he understood. Say that again, he said finally, his voice quieter now, stripped of its earlier amusement, and Lena did not rush. She did not apologize. She simply repeated the key phrase, once more in Icelandic, each word placed with precision, then translated it again into English, slower this time, as if she was not just correcting him, but teaching the entire table what they had failed to hear. One of the investors leaned forward, pulling out his tablet, scrolling quickly through the digital contract, his brows tightening as the realization began to settle in. She is right, the man said under his breath, almost to himself, and that was when the silence shifted into something heavier, something undeniable. Victor leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly, but his gaze never left Lena. Not even for a second. Explain it, he said, not as a command this time, but as a request, controlled, measured, and Lena gave a small nod, stepping slightly closer to the table, her presence still calm, still grounded, as if she had done this before, many times, in rooms that looked very different from this one. The clause you referenced, she began, her tone even. It does not limit liability the way you think it does. It actually transfers the risk entirely after 6 months if certain conditions are not met. She paused just briefly, letting the weight of the words land. And those conditions are not clearly defined. Another investor now leaned in, reading more carefully, his expression tightening. That would expose the company to significant loss, he said, louder this time. And Victor's jaw flexed slightly, not in anger, but in recognition, the kind that comes when control slips just enough to be felt. How much? Victor asked, his voice steady, but lower, and Lena met his gaze again, unflinching. Based on the structure of the deal, approximately $12 million within the first year, she said. And this time, no one questioned her, not the investors, not the lawyers dialing in through muted conference calls, not even Victor himself. Because the way she said it left no room for doubt, only certainty, the kind that did not need to raise its voice to be heard. Victor glanced down at the contract, then back at Lena, his mind moving quickly now, recalculating, adjusting. But there was something else there too, something unfamiliar, something quieter, respect, though he would not name it yet. Where did you learn Icelandic? He asked suddenly, the question slipping out before he could filter it. And for the first time, something shifted in Lena's expression, not hesitation, not discomfort, just a flicker of something deeper, something private. I studied it, she said simply, and then she added, almost as an afterthought, along with a few others. Victor studied her more closely now, really seeing her, the steadiness in her posture, the way she chose her words, the absence of any need to impress, and it unsettled him in a way that no competitor ever had. Because this was not a challenge he could buy, negotiate, or outmaneuver. This was something else entirely, something he had overlooked. You are not just a waitress, he said, more to himself than to her, and Lena did not react to that either. She simply gave a small, polite nod, the same one she would give any customer, and stepped back, as if her part in this moment was already finished, as if she had only done what needed to be done, nothing more, nothing less. But Victor was not finished, not even close, because as Lena turned to leave, he realized something that tightened his chest in a way he could not ignore. This was not luck. This was not coincidence. This was someone who had been underestimated for far too long. And for the first time in years, Victor Kane felt the uncomfortable weight of a question he could not immediately answer. How many times had he dismissed someone like her without ever realizing what he had just lost? Victor Kane did not return to his phone, and that alone unsettled everyone at the table, because men like him always returned to their devices, to their numbers, to their controlled world of predictable outcomes. But now he sat still, eyes fixed on the empty space Lena Brooks had just left behind, as if the answer he needed might still be standing there. One of the investors cleared his throat quietly, attempting to reset the moment. We should revise the clause before moving forward, he said. Cautious, almost deferential now, and Victor nodded once, but his attention drifted again, not to the contract, not to the numbers, but to the memory of her voice, steady, unshaken, precise in a way that did not ask for approval. Give me 5 minutes, Victor said abruptly, rising from his chair, the movement smooth but decisive, leaving the table in a silence that felt very different from before. This was not the silence of control. This was the silence of recalibration. He walked through the restaurant with measured steps, past polished tables and quiet conversations, until he reached the edge of the service corridor, where the light shifted from warm gold to a softer, more practical glow. And there she was, Lena, standing near the counter, speaking quietly with another server, her posture relaxed, as if nothing extraordinary had happened, as if she had not just altered the course of a multi-million-dollar decision. Victor paused for a moment, observing. Something he rarely did without purpose. He noticed the small details now, the way she listened more than she spoke, the way her movements were efficient but never rushed, the way she carried herself with a quiet confidence that did not need to be displayed. and it unsettled him again, because confidence without performance was something he did not encounter often. "Lena," he said, her name unfamiliar on his tongue, and she turned, meeting his gaze with the same calm expression, no surprise, no eagerness, just acknowledgement. "Yes, sir," she replied, polite, professional, but not submissive, and for a brief moment, Victor did not know how to begin, a rare pause in a life defined by immediate decisions. "Walk with me," he said finally, gesturing toward a quieter corner near the back, and Lena hesitated only slightly before following. Not out of obligation, but out of choice, and that distinction did not go unnoticed. They stopped near a small window where the city lights filtered through, casting faint reflections across the glass. Victor turned to face her fully now. No table between them, no audience, just a conversation he could not delegate. "You saved that deal," he said, direct, without embellishment, and Lena shook her head gently. "I corrected a mistake," she replied, her voice even, and something in that response shifted the weight of the moment again, because she did not claim credit. She did not seek recognition. She simply stated what was true. Victor studied her, searching for something hidden, an angle, a motive, anything that would make this interaction fit into a familiar pattern, but there was nothing obvious to grasp. "You said you studied Icelandic," he continued. "Where?" And Lena looked past him for a second, as if the answer lived somewhere behind the present moment. "A long time ago," she said quietly, then added, "It was part of a larger program." Victor narrowed his eyes slightly. "Which program?" he asked, and Lena's gaze returned to his, steady, grounded. "Linguistics," she said, and then, after a brief pause, "International contracts." The words landed with quiet clarity, and Victor felt something shift again, a connection forming where there had been none before. "You worked in contracts," he said, more statement than question, and Lena did not deny it. She simply gave a small nod, and in that moment, the distance between who she appeared to be and who she actually was became impossible to ignore. Victor exhaled slowly, processing, recalculating, and for the first time, something felt out of his control in a way that was not threatening, but revealing. "Then why are you here?" he asked, the question direct, but no longer dismissive, and Lena held his gaze for a moment longer, just long enough for silence to speak first, before she answered. "Because sometimes life changes the plan," she said, her voice soft, but firm, and then she stepped back slightly, signaling the end of the conversation without needing to say it, leaving Victor standing there, not with answers, but with something far more unfamiliar, curiosity that he could not ignore, and a quiet realization beginning to take shape, that the most valuable things in the room had never been on the table at all. Victor Kane stood there a moment longer after Lena walked away, the quiet hum of the service corridor settling back into place as if nothing had shifted, but everything had. He turned slowly, returning to the main dining room with measured steps. Yet something in his posture had changed, less rigid, less certain. The table fell silent the second he approached, conversations halting mid-sentence as his presence reclaimed the space. But this time it did not carry the same weight of unquestioned control. It carried something else, something the others could not quite name. Victor took his seat without a word, his eyes moving briefly over the contract displayed on the tablet in front of him. But his focus did not stay there, not entirely. "We revised the clause," he said calmly, his voice steady but no longer dismissive. "Clarify the liability terms, define the conditions explicitly, and restructure the timeline." One of the investors nodded quickly, almost relieved to move forward, while another glanced toward the direction Lena had disappeared, as if still trying to reconcile what had just happened. "That adjustment will protect the first-year exposure," the investor added, and Victor gave a short nod. But then he did something unexpected. He pushed the tablet slightly forward, away from himself. "Draft it now," he said. "I want to review before we finalize anything." The room shifted again, subtle but clear, because Victor Kane did not usually wait. He decided. He executed. He moved on. But now he was choosing to pause, to verify, to listen, and that shift echoed louder than any raised voice ever could. Minutes passed as the legal team worked through the revisions, fingers moving quickly across screens. Quiet discussions happening in low tones. But Victor's attention drifted again, not to the numbers, not to the projections, but to a single, persistent thought. How had he missed it? How had he dismissed someone with that level of precision, that level of awareness? Without even noticing, he leaned back slightly, exhaling slowly, and for the first time in a long while, he replayed a moment not to optimize it, but to understand it. Across the room, Lena moved between tables with the same quiet efficiency, refilling glasses, clearing plates, her presence blending seamlessly into the background once more, as if the earlier moment had never existed. And that contrast unsettled him more than anything else, because it meant she could choose when to be seen and when to disappear, a level of control that did not rely on power or position. But something deeper, something internal. Mr. Kane, one of the investors said carefully, drawing his attention back. The revised clause is ready for your review. Victor leaned forward, scanning the updated language, his mind sharp, focused, but now with a different edge, not just speed, but awareness. He read through each line carefully, catching details he might have overlooked before, adjusting phrasing, refining structure, until finally he set the tablet down. This works, he said, simply, and the deal moved forward, but it did not feel like a victory, not in the way it usually did. There was no quiet satisfaction, no sense of dominance. Instead, there was something unfamiliar, something quieter, respect for a moment that had not belonged to him. As the meeting concluded and the investors began to gather their things, one of them spoke up. That waitress, he said, hesitating slightly. She might have just saved us more than money. Victor did not respond immediately, his gaze drifting once more across the room, finding Lena again as she stood near the counter, writing something down, her posture unchanged, her expression calm, as if she had already moved on. Yes, Victor said finally, his voice low, almost thoughtful. She did. But he did not look away this time, because now he understood something he had not before. That value did not always announce itself, that intelligence did not always seek recognition, and that sometimes the most important voice in the room was the one no one had thought to listen to. And as Lena turned slightly, unaware of his gaze, Victor Kane made a decision that did not come from strategy or calculation, but from something far more rare. He was not going to let this moment disappear like everything else he had overlooked before. Victor Kane remained seated long after the others had stood, their chairs sliding back with soft, polite sounds as conversations resumed in low voices. But his world had shifted into something quieter, more focused. He watched as the last of the investors shook his hand, their expressions respectful, their tone careful. The deal was secured, the numbers aligned. Everything had gone exactly as it should have, and yet it did not feel complete. Not yet. As the group dispersed, Victor's gaze moved, again across the room, instinctively, almost involuntarily, searching for Lena Brooks, and he found her near the far side of the dining area, placing a receipt on a table, her posture composed, her movements steady, the same as before, unchanged by what had happened. And that was the part he could not ignore, because moments like that usually left a mark, a shift in behavior, a trace of recognition. But not with her. She moved on as if her role had never been central, as if she had simply corrected a detail and returned to her work. Nothing more, nothing less. Victor stood slowly, adjusting his jacket out of habit, but his mind was no longer on appearances, it was on understanding. He crossed the room again, this time without hesitation, without performance, just intention. Lena noticed him approaching, but her expression did not change. She finished placing the receipt, gave a small nod to the customer, and turned to face him fully. "Is everything satisfactory, sir?" she asked, her tone professional, neutral, as if they had not already shared a conversation that altered the course of his decision. Victor paused for a brief moment, studying her again, searching for any sign that she expected something, recognition, gratitude, opportunity, but there was nothing, only calm presence. "No," he said, and the word surprised even him, because it was not dissatisfaction that he meant. It was something else, something incomplete. Lena waited, not interrupting, not reacting, simply allowing the silence to exist, and that silence gave his words weight. "It is not complete," he added, his voice steady, more honest than it had been all evening. Lena tilted her head slightly, not in confusion, but in quiet curiosity. "What is missing?" she asked, and Victor held her gaze for a second longer than necessary, then answered, "You." The word landed between them. Not as an offer, not as a demand, but as a recognition, and Lena did not respond immediately. Her expression remained composed, but there was a subtle shift in her eyes, a flicker of something deeper, something that acknowledged the change in him without fully accepting it. "I believe you already have everything you need," she said calmly, and her words were not dismissive, they were grounded. As if she had already measured the situation and reached a conclusion, Victor exhaled slowly, realizing that this conversation was not one he could control, not one he could steer with confidence or authority. "You understand contracts, languages, risk," he said, his tone measured. "You see what others miss." Lena listened, but she did not step closer, did not lean in. She remained exactly where she was, grounded in her space. "Those are skills," she replied softly, "not a position." And again, the simplicity of her answer carried more weight than any argument. Victor nodded slightly, absorbing it, adjusting. "Then let me ask differently," he said, his voice quieter now. "Why did you choose to speak?" And this time, Lena did not answer immediately. She looked past him for a brief moment, as if considering not just the question, but the meaning behind it. And when she spoke, her voice was steady, but softer than before. "Because it mattered," she said, and then she added, just as simply, "and no one else was going to say it." The words settled into the space between them, clear, undeniable, and Victor felt something shift again, something deeper than curiosity now, something closer to understanding, not of her entirely, but of the moment, of what he had nearly missed. And as Lena turned slightly, preparing to return to her work once more, Victor realized that this was not the end of the conversation, not even close, because for the first time in a long time, he was not thinking about the deal he had just closed. He was thinking about the one opportunity he had not yet begun to understand. Victor Kane did not stop her this time, not immediately, and that was the difference, because earlier he had approached with questions, with control, with the quiet assumption that every conversation would bend toward his direction. But now he watched Lena Brooks walk away with a different kind of attention, not to interrupt, not to redirect, but to understand. She moved back into the rhythm of the restaurant, as if the moment they had just shared had already dissolved into the background. Picking up a tray, exchanging a few quiet words with another server, her presence steady, grounded, untouched by the shift that had unsettled him so deeply. And Victor stood there for a second longer than necessary, feeling something unfamiliar settle in, not urgency, not impatience, but restraint, a rare pause that did not come from strategy, but from awareness. He turned slightly, glancing around the dining room, the polished surfaces, the quiet conversations, the controlled environment that had always made sense to him, and yet now it felt incomplete, as if something essential had been revealed and could no longer be ignored. He returned to his table slowly, but he did not sit. Instead, he picked up the leather folder containing the bill, opening it without really looking, his mind elsewhere, replaying her words. Because it mattered, simple, direct, without performance, and it lingered, not because it was impressive, but because it was true. He signed the receipt without checking the amount, something he rarely did, and placed the folder back on the table with a quiet motion. Then he looked up again, scanning the room, not for status, not for influence, but for her. Lena was near the far end now, speaking with an older couple, her tone soft, her expression attentive, the kind of presence that did not demand attention, but earned it. And Victor noticed something else now, something he had not seen before. The way people responded to her, the subtle shift in their posture, the ease in their expressions, as if she brought something into the space that had nothing to do with service and everything to do with presence. He stepped away from the table again, this time without hesitation, without the need to justify it, crossing the room with a quiet determination that did not draw attention, but carried weight nonetheless. When he reached her, he did not interrupt. He waited, allowing her to finish her interaction, and that small decision marked a change more significant than anything he had said so far. Lena turned to him once the couple had left, her expression calm, but now there was something else there too. Not surprise, but recognition, as if she understood that this conversation was not over. "Is there something else you need?" she asked, her tone the same, steady, professional, but no longer distant. and Victor met her gaze, holding it for a moment, choosing his words carefully, something he rarely had to do. "I want to understand something," he said, and the honesty in his voice was subtle, but real. Lena did not respond immediately. She simply waited, giving him the space to continue. "You saw the risk," he went on. "You knew the outcome, and you still waited." He paused briefly, as if the question itself needed to settle before it could be asked fully. "Why?" Lena's eyes held his, steady, grounded, and for a moment, the noise of the restaurant faded again, not because the room had changed, but because the focus had. "Because timing matters," she said quietly, and then she added, just as simply, "People do not hear what they are not ready to hear." The words landed with quiet clarity, and Victor felt them in a way he did not expect, not as information, but as reflection. He exhaled slowly, processing, adjusting. "And I was not ready," he said, more to himself than to her, and Lena gave a small nod, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement. "You were busy being certain," she replied, her tone gentle, but precise, and there was no accusation in it, only truth. Victor looked down briefly, then back at her, something shifting again, deeper this time, something closer to humility than he had felt in years. "And now?" he asked, his voice quieter, more grounded. "Am I ready?" Lena studied him for a moment, not evaluating, not judging, but simply observing, and then she gave a small, almost imperceptible smile, the first hint of warmth that had broken through her calm exterior. "That depends," she said, and her voice carried a quiet weight that held his attention completely. "Are you listening now?" The question did not demand an answer. It created space for one, and Victor stood there, not with a response, but with a realization that settled slowly, but firmly, that this was not a conversation about language or contracts or even intelligence. It was about something far more rare, the moment when certainty gives way to awareness, and in that moment, everything begins to change. Victor did not answer her question right away, and that silence was not hesitation. It was the first time in years he was actually listening without preparing a response. The noise of the restaurant returned slowly, the soft clinking of glasses, the distant murmur of conversations, but none of it pulled his focus away from Lena Brooks standing in front of him, steady, composed, waiting without expectation. And something about that patience unsettled him more than pressure ever could. Because she was not trying to influence him, she was not trying to prove anything. She was simply present, and that forced him to meet the moment without the usual armor he carried into every interaction. "Yes," he said finally, his voice quieter, more grounded than before. "I am listening." And Lena held his gaze for a brief second longer, as if measuring the weight of that answer, not judging it, just acknowledging it. Then she gave a small nod, not approval, not reward, just recognition. "Then you will start to see what was always there," she said softly, and the words did not sound like advice. They sounded like a fact, something inevitable rather than optional. Victor exhaled slowly, absorbing it, and for the first time the conversation did not feel like something to win. It felt like something to understand. He glanced briefly toward the table where his meeting had taken place, now empty. The chairs pushed back neatly, the documents closed, everything in order, and yet it felt distant, almost irrelevant compared to the quiet clarity standing in front of him. "You knew they would not catch it," he said, his tone thoughtful, not accusatory, and Lena tilted her head slightly, considering the question. "I knew they were focused on the outcome," she replied, "not the structure." Victor nodded slowly. Because he recognized that pattern, he had built his entire career on driving outcomes, on pushing forward, on making decisions quickly and decisively. And it had worked, until a moment like this revealed the gap in that approach. "And you are not," he said, more as an observation than a question, and Lena gave a faint smile, almost imperceptible. "I focus on what holds everything together," she said, and that answer settled into him differently, because it was not about intelligence alone. It was about perspective, about where attention is placed and why. Victor looked at her more closely now, not as a role, not as a position, but as a person with a depth he had not taken the time to see before. "You could be doing something else," he said, the thought forming as he spoke it. "Something bigger." Lena did not react to the word bigger. She did not lean into it or push against it. She simply met his gaze with the same calm steadiness. This is something, she said, and there was no defensiveness in her voice, only quiet certainty. Victor paused, realizing the assumption behind his own words, the belief that value had to be tied to scale, to visibility, to status. And for the first time he saw how narrow that view had been. You do not measure it the same way, he said, and Lena shook her head gently. I measure it by impact, she replied, not by how many people notice. And that shifted something deeper, something foundational, because it challenged the very framework he had used to define success. Victor looked away briefly, then back at her, and there was something different in his expression now, not just curiosity, not just respect, but a quiet recognition of a perspective he had overlooked for far too long. You changed the outcome tonight, he said, his voice steady, and Lena shook her head once more, the same calm correction as before. No, she said softly. I changed your attention, and that landed heavier than anything else she had said. Because it was true in a way that reached beyond the moment, beyond the deal, beyond the restaurant itself. And Victor stood there, not with a counterpoint, not with a strategy, but with a realization that settled slowly and firmly, that the most important shift had not happened in the contract, it had happened in him. And as Lena turned slightly, ready to return to her work once again, Victor understood something he had not before, that this was not the end of a conversation, it was the beginning of a different way of seeing, one that could not be undone once it had begun. The shift did not happen loudly, it never does. It settled quietly in Victor Kane's posture as he stood there watching Lena Brooks step back into the rhythm of her work, but something inside him refused to return to what it had been just minutes ago. Because once you see something clearly, you cannot pretend it is not there. He turned slowly, walking back toward his table again. But this time his steps were not driven by habit. They were deliberate, measured, aware. He reached for his phone out of instinct, then stopped, his hand hovering for a second before he let it fall back to his side. The screen stayed dark, the messages unread, for the first time in years. Urgency did not win, attention did. He sat down briefly, not because he needed to, but because he needed a moment to think without movement. The leather chair creaked softly beneath him as he leaned back, his eyes drifting across the restaurant again. But now he was not scanning for status or advantage. He was observing, noticing the details he had trained himself to ignore, the quiet coordination between staff, the subtle exchanges that kept everything running smoothly, the way Lena anticipated needs before they were spoken, the way she listened with her full attention when someone spoke to her, as if nothing else existed in that moment. And it struck him how rare that was, even in his world of high-level negotiations, where people spoke constantly but rarely listened. She changed your attention, he repeated quietly to himself, the words landing differently each time, deeper, more precise, because they were not about her anymore. They were about him, about the way he moved through the world, about what he chose to see and what he dismissed without thought. He stood again after a moment, this time with a clearer sense of direction, not toward the exit, not yet, but toward something unfinished. He found Lena again near the counter, writing something on a small notepad, her movements unhurried, focused, present, and when she looked up, meeting his gaze, there was no surprise, only awareness, as if she had already sensed that he would return. I have one more question, Victor said, his voice calm, no longer carrying the weight of authority, but something quieter, more grounded. Lena closed the notepad gently, giving him her full attention, the kind that did not rush or divide itself. Go ahead, she said, and Victor held her gaze, choosing his words carefully. If no one noticed, if no one asked, would you still have said something? The question hung between them, simple on the surface, but layered with everything that had happened. Lena considered it for a moment, not searching for the right answer, but for the true one, and when she spoke, her voice was steady. Unchanged, yes, she said, without hesitation, and Victor nodded slightly, because he believed her, not because of confidence, but because of consistency. Everything she had done aligned with that answer. Even if it cost you? He asked, and Lena's expression did not shift, not in fear, not in doubt, only in clarity. Then it would cost me, she replied, and there was no drama in it, no sense of sacrifice, only acceptance, and that was what made it powerful, because it was not about proving something, it was about being something, Victor exhaled slowly, the weight of that answer settling into him, reshaping something deeper than a single decision, because it revealed a standard that did not depend on circumstance. Most people would stay quiet, he said, more as an observation than a challenge, and Lena gave a faint nod. Most people are waiting for permission, she said, and then she added, just as quietly, I am not. The words landed with a quiet finality that did not need emphasis, and Victor felt it, not as pressure, but as clarity, the kind that removes excuses instead of creating them. He looked at her for a moment longer, then nodded once, a small gesture, but one that carried more meaning than any agreement he had signed that night. Because this was not about a deal, it was about a shift, and as Lena picked up her tray again, stepping back into the flow of the restaurant, Victor Kane understood something he had never fully grasped before. That power was not always loud. It was not always visible, and sometimes it looked like a quiet voice that chose to speak when it mattered, even when no one was ready to listen. Victor did not follow her this time, and that was intentional, because something in him understood that this moment was not about proximity. It was about perspective. He stood still for a few seconds, watching Lena Brooks move effortlessly through the restaurant once again, her presence blending into the background, yet somehow shaping everything around her. And for the first time, he saw the contrast clearly, not just between her and the room, but between who he had been and who he was beginning to become. He turned toward the exit slowly, his hand reaching for his coat, but his mind was not leaving with him. It lingered, replaying every word, every pause, every quiet certainty she had carried without needing to prove it. Outside, the city air was cooler, sharper, the kind that forced awareness whether you wanted it or not. The streetlights reflected off polished cars lined along the curb, engines idling, drivers waiting, everything exactly as it had always been, controlled, predictable, efficient. But Victor did not move toward his car right away. He stood on the sidewalk, looking back through the large glass windows of the restaurant, his reflection faint against the warm interior light. And there she was again, just inside, carrying a tray, listening to a customer with full attention, as if the rest of the world could wait. And something about that image held him there, longer than he expected, because it did not fit into any framework he had built his life around. It was not driven by urgency, not measured by scale, and yet it carried a weight he could not ignore. His phone buzzed in his pocket, once, then again, messages stacking, updates, confirmations, the deal moving forward, everything progressing exactly as planned. He pulled the phone out, glanced at the screen, then locked it again without reading a single message, slipping it back into his pocket with a quiet decision that felt more significant than any transaction he had made that night. He stepped toward his car finally, the driver already moving to open the door, but Victor paused, his hand resting lightly on the handle. And in that brief pause, something shifted again, not dramatic, not visible, but real. Wait, he said quietly, and the driver froze, uncertain. Victor turned back toward the restaurant once more, his gaze steady, focused, and without another word, he stepped away from the car, walking back toward the entrance with a clarity that had nothing to do with business. Inside, the atmosphere had not changed. Conversations continued, glasses clinked, the quiet rhythm of service moved forward. But for Victor, everything felt different, because now he was not just present, he was aware. He moved through the space without urgency, without the need to be noticed, until he reached the counter where Lena stood once again, writing something down, and when she looked up, meeting his gaze, there was no surprise, only that same calm recognition, as if she had already understood that this was not finished. "You came back," she said softly, not as a question, but as an observation, and Victor nodded once, his expression steady, grounded in a way it had not been before. "I was not done listening," he replied. And for the first time, there was no trace of performance in his voice, no underlying agenda, just honesty. Lena studied him for a moment, not evaluating, not testing, simply observing, and then she gave a small nod, the kind that acknowledged effort without praising it. "Then you should ask the right question," she said, and Victor felt something settle into place, not an answer, but a direction. "What is the right question?" he asked, and Lena's eyes held his, steady, clear. "Not what you can gain," she said quietly, But what you have been missing. The words did not echo, they did not demand attention, but they stayed, grounding themselves in a way that could not be ignored. And Victor stood there, not rushing to respond, not trying to solve it immediately, because for the first time, he understood that the value was not in the speed of the answer, but in the depth of the question. And as the moment settled between them, something became clear in a way it never had before, that this night was not about a deal. It was not about a mistake corrected. It was about a shift that could not be undone. And the question Lena had just placed in front of him was one that would follow him long after he walked out of that door again. Victor did not speak immediately after her words settled, because for the first time, silence did not feel like something to fill. It felt like something to hold. He stood there, looking at Lena Brooks, but not trying to analyze her, not trying to define her role. Instead, he let the question she had given him expand in his mind. Not what you can gain, but what you have been missing. And it shifted the way he processed everything around him. The restaurant, the people, even himself. He glanced around slowly, noticing details that had always been there, but had never registered as important: the quiet coordination behind the counter, the subtle signals between staff, the way Lena anticipated needs before they were spoken. It was not efficiency alone, it was awareness. And Victor realized that his world, for all its precision, often moved too fast to notice what actually held things together. "I have been missing this," he said finally, his voice low, not directed at her, but grounded in the realization itself. Lena did not respond with surprise or agreement. She simply listened, allowing him to reach the thought fully on his own. "Not the language," he added. "Not the contract, but the attention." He paused, then looked at her again, and this time there was no distance in his gaze, no assumption, only clarity. "I see outcomes," he continued. "I push forward, I decide quickly, and it works until it does not." Lena gave a small nod, acknowledging the truth without needing to reinforce it. "Speed can build something," she said quietly, "but it can also skip what matters." And Victor felt that land with precision, because it did not dismiss what he had built. It revealed the cost of how he had built it. He exhaled slowly, his posture relaxing in a way that had nothing to do with comfort and everything to do with release. "And you do the opposite," he said, more certain now. "You slowed down enough to see what holds everything together." Lena's expression softened slightly, not in approval, but in recognition. "I pay attention to the structure," she replied, "because that is what lasts." And something in that sentence shifted deeper than the moment. It connected beyond the deal, beyond the restaurant, into the way Victor had approached every decision, every interaction, every assumption about value. He looked down briefly, then back at her, and there was something new in his expression, not just respect, but alignment beginning to form. "You are right," he said simply, and the words were not difficult to say, but they carried weight because they were real. Lena did not respond with validation. She did not need to. The acknowledgement itself was enough, a quiet shift that did not require confirmation. Victor reached into his jacket slowly, pulling out a small card, the kind he had handed out thousands of times. But this time his movement paused before he extended it, as if the gesture itself needed to be reconsidered. He looked at the card, then back at Lena, and for a moment, he saw how limited it felt. A name, a title, a number, a shortcut to access. And he lowered his hand slightly, choosing his words instead. "I want to continue this conversation," he said, and there was no offer hidden inside it. No transaction implied, just intention. Lena met his gaze, steady, thoughtful, and for a brief moment, the noise of the room faded again, not because it disappeared, but because it no longer mattered. "Then do not rush it," she said softly, and the simplicity of her answer carried more direction than any instruction he had received in years. Victor nodded once, understanding what she meant, that this was not something to schedule, not something to control. It was something to approach differently, and that required more than a meeting. It required a shift. He slipped the card back into his jacket, a small gesture, but a meaningful one, because it marked a change in how he chose to engage, not through position, but through presence. Lena picked up her tray again, preparing to move, and Victor stepped back slightly, giving her space, not because he had to, but because he understood that space mattered. And as she turned to continue her work, He realized something that settled with quiet certainty, that this was not about bringing her into his world, it was about learning to see beyond it. And as he stood there, no longer in a rush to leave, no longer driven by the next outcome, Victor Kane understood that the most valuable shift of the night had not been in the deal he had secured, but in the perspective he had finally begun to change. Victor did not leave immediately after that, and that alone marked a shift no one else in the room could fully understand, because for years his time had been measured in efficiency, in movement, in the next decision waiting to be made. But now he remained where he was, standing in a space that no longer felt like a temporary stop, but something worth staying in. He watched Lena Brooks move through the restaurant again, her rhythm unchanged, her presence steady, and the more he observed, the more he realized something he had never accounted for: consistency, not in performance, but in principle. She did not adjust herself based on who stood in front of her. She did not become louder for power or quieter for status. She simply remained the same, grounded in a standard that did not require validation, and that unsettled him in a way no competition ever had, because it could not be influenced, bought, or redirected. It simply existed. He walked slowly back toward the table where his meeting had taken place, now completely cleared, the surface clean, reset for the next group. And it struck him how quickly moments disappeared in his world: decisions made, deals closed, conversations forgotten, everything replaced by what came next. But this moment refused to fade in the same way. It held, quietly, firmly, as if it demanded to be carried forward rather than left behind. He reached for the chair and sat down again, not out of necessity, but out of intention, and for a brief second. He closed his eyes, not to escape, but to process the language, the correction, the pause, the shift in his own thinking. It all aligned into something clearer now, not just a moment of being corrected, but a moment of being redirected. He opened his eyes again, looking across the room with a perspective that felt sharper, more grounded, and he noticed something else, something that had always been present but never relevant to him before. The people around him were not just roles, not just functions within a system. They were individuals carrying their own knowledge, their own perspectives, their own unseen depth, and he had been moving too fast to recognize that. "You miss what you do not look for," he said quietly to himself, the words forming without effort, and they felt true in a way that was difficult to ignore. He stood again, not with urgency, but with clarity, and this time when he walked toward Lena, there was no hesitation, no need to pause or reconsider, only intention. She was near the service station again, organizing a few receipts, her movements precise, focused, and when she looked up, meeting his gaze, there was that same calm awareness, as if she had already anticipated this continuation. "You are still here," she said softly, not surprised, just acknowledging, and Victor gave a slight nod, his expression steady, but different now, not just curious, but resolved. "I am," he replied, and then he paused, not because he did not know what to say, but because he wanted to say it correctly, something he had not prioritized before. "You said this is about attention," he continued, "about what holds things together." Lena listened, her posture unchanged, but her focus fully present. "I built everything by moving forward," Victor said, his voice calm, reflective. "But I never stopped to ask what I was stepping over." The words settled between them, and Lena's eyes held his, steady, thoughtful, as if she understood not just the statement, but the realization behind it. "Most people do not," she said quietly, and there was no judgment in her tone, only observation. "Because stopping feels like losing time." Victor nodded slowly, recognizing the truth in that, the pressure to keep moving, to keep building, to keep proving. "But sometimes," Lena added, her voice just as steady, "stopping is how you see what time was trying to show you." And that landed deeper than anything else she had said, because it reframed something fundamental, not as delay, not as inefficiency, but as awareness. Victor exhaled slowly, the weight of that understanding settling in, reshaping the way he saw not just the moment, but the pattern behind it. "Then I have been missing more than I realized," he said, and this time there was no resistance in his voice, no need to defend or justify, only acceptance. Lena gave a small nod, not as confirmation, but as acknowledgement, and for a moment, Neither of them spoke, because the silence itself carried the meaning forward, and in that silence, Victor Kane understood something that could not be undone, that the most valuable shift was not in what he gained tonight, but in what he finally learned to see. And as Lena turned once more to continue her work, he did not feel the need to follow, because for the first time, he knew exactly where to begin looking. The night did not end the way Victor Kane expected, and that was the only reason it mattered. He stood near the center of the restaurant for a moment longer, not as a man deciding his next move, but as someone reconsidering every move that had brought him here. The room continued as it always did, conversations flowing, plates moving, the quiet rhythm of service uninterrupted. Yet something had shifted in a way that could not be seen but could be felt, and Victor knew it would not fade when he walked out the door this time. He turned slowly toward the exit again, his steps measured, but different now, not driven by urgency, but by awareness. And as he reached the door, his hand paused on the handle, not out of hesitation, but reflection. Because leaving meant returning to a world that had always rewarded speed, certainty, and control, and for the first time, he questioned whether that world had been incomplete. He stepped outside into the cool night air, the city alive with motion, headlights stretching into long lines, distant sounds blending into a steady hum, and everything looked the same, but he did not see it the same way. His car waited at the curb, engine running, the driver already stepping forward, but Victor raised a hand slightly, signaling him to wait, and he stood there for a second longer, looking back through the glass once more. Lena Brooks moved inside with the same calm precision, unaffected by his presence or absence, and that was what stayed with him. She had not needed him to change, she had not tried to change him. She had simply remained consistent, and that consistency had done what no pressure ever could. It had revealed something he could no longer ignore. He stepped into the car finally, the door closing with a soft, controlled sound, the interior quiet, insulated from the noise outside, and for a moment, he did not speak. He simply sat there, his reflection faint in the dark glass, and then he leaned forward slightly, his voice steady but carrying a different weight than it had before. "Tomorrow," he said, and the driver glanced at him through the mirror. "Waiting. Clear my morning," Victor continued, and there was no urgency in his tone, only intention, the kind that did not need to be explained. "Where to, sir?" the driver asked, and Victor looked out the window again, the restaurant still visible behind them, the warm light contrasting with the darker street, and for a brief moment, he considered giving a direct answer, a location, a plan, something structured, something familiar, but instead he said something else, something that reflected the shift that had begun. "We will start with what I have been missing," he replied, and the driver hesitated for a fraction of a second, not understanding, but nodding anyway. Because some instructions are not meant to be clear immediately, they are meant to be followed into clarity. The car began to move slowly, pulling away from the curb, and Victor watched the restaurant fade into the distance. But the moment did not fade with it. It stayed, grounded in a way that did not depend on proximity, because it was no longer about the place or the conversation. It was about the change that had already taken hold. He leaned back in his seat, his mind not racing forward as it usually did, not calculating the next deal or the next move, but reflecting, tracing the pattern of how he had seen the world before and how that perspective had shifted, and for the first time in a long while, he did not feel the need to fill that space with action. He let it exist, because now he understood something that had been missing from every decision he had made, that awareness was not a delay, it was the foundation. And as the city lights moved past the window in quiet streaks, Victor Kane realized that the most important part of this night had not been what he gained, but what he could no longer ignore, and somewhere behind him, in a restaurant that would look the same tomorrow as it did tonight, Lena Brooks would continue her work, unchanged, steady, grounded, and that was exactly why everything else had begun to change. The car moved through the city, but something in Victor Kane no longer moved the same way. The pace was still there, the structure, the precision, but the urgency had softened into something quieter, something more deliberate, the kind of awareness that does not rush to prove itself. The next morning arrived without spectacle, no dramatic change, no announcement, just a shift in how he stepped into the day. His office looked the same, glass walls, polished surfaces, screens already filled with numbers and projections. But Victor did not go straight to them. Instead, he stood for a moment by the window, watching the city wake up below, people moving in patterns he had once dismissed as background. And now he saw something else: intention, effort, quiet systems holding everything together. He turned back toward his desk, but instead of opening the pending contracts, he reached for something simpler, a blank page, and began reviewing not what was urgent, but what was foundational: the clauses that held deals together, the assumptions that had gone unchallenged, the details he had once trusted others to manage, and one by one, he slowed down enough to see them clearly. The hours passed. Differently that day, not faster, not slower, but deeper. Conversations shifted too. When his team spoke, he listened fully, not waiting to respond, not preparing the next move, but understanding the structure behind what was being said. And the room felt it, subtle at first, then undeniable, because attention changes everything. By the afternoon, one of his senior analysts hesitated before presenting a projection, something small, almost invisible, but Victor noticed. "What are we missing?" he asked calmly, and the question landed differently than it ever had before, not as pressure, but as permission. The analyst paused, then spoke again, this time with more honesty, pointing out a detail that could have been overlooked, and Victor nodded, not because it surprised him, but because he expected it now. That depth, that awareness, and for the first time, the room did not feel like a place where answers were demanded. It felt like a place where clarity was built. Later that evening, as the day settled into quiet, Victor found himself standing outside the same restaurant once more, not out of routine, but intention. He stepped inside without urgency, the warm light greeting him like it had the night before. But this time he was not arriving as a man in control. He was arriving as someone who understood the value of what he did not control. Lena Brooks was there, moving through the space with the same calm presence. And when their eyes met, there was no surprise, no shift, just recognition. Victor did not interrupt her work. He waited, and when she approached, he spoke simply. "I started listening." And that was all. No explanation, no performance, just truth. Lena studied him for a moment, and then she gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. Not approval, not validation, just acknowledgement. And that was enough, because this was never about proving anything. It was about becoming aware. Victor did not stay long that night. He did not need to. The conversation had already done its work, and as he stepped back outside into the quiet air, something settled fully into place, not as a lesson learned, but as a standard chosen. That attention, true attention, was not a skill, it was a decision, and once made, it changes everything. He looked back once more, not out of habit, but gratitude, quiet, unspoken, the kind that does not need to be returned to matter. And somewhere inside, Lena continued her work, unchanged, steady, grounded, a reminder that dignity does not need an audience to exist. It simply shows up, every day, in the way someone chooses to be, and maybe that is what stayed with him the most. Not the language, not the deal, but the quiet certainty that the most powerful thing in the room is not always the loudest. Sometimes it is the one who listens. And if this story made you pause, even for a moment, then perhaps you have already started to see what was always there.